April 1943, the first encounter. Over the fields of occupied France, Luftwaffe pilots first spotted the unusual silhouette climbing toward them through the morning haze. The massive American fighter appeared almost comically bulky against the sky, a flying contradiction to everything German pilots knew about fighter aircraft design. Fliege and Milchflash, they radioed to each other, laughing. The flying milk bottle. How could this 7-ton behemoth possibly challenge the sleek, proven Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that had dominated European skies for years? Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a seasoned ace with 17 kills, watched the approaching P-47s with amusement mixed with confusion. The aircraft seemed to waddle through the air, its enormous fuselage housing what appeared to be an engine far too large for any sensible fighter design. To the battle-hardened German pilots, this was another example of American inexperience, throwing resources at problems without understanding the nuanced art of aerial combat that the Luftwaffe had perfected over years of warfare. They were about to learn a terrible lesson. Within months, the distinctive roar of Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines would trigger what German pilots came to call a jabot fever, a visceral dread that would haunt them for the remainder of the war. Chapter 1: The Genesis of Thunder. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt begins in 1940, in the drafting rooms of Republic Aviation Corporation in Farmingdale, Long Island. Chief designer Alexander Kartveli faced an impossible challenge: create a fighter that could outperform anything in the sky while incorporating lessons learned from the brutal air war already raging over Europe. Kartveli's team studied intelligence reports from the Battle of Britain with meticulous attention. The reports painted a clear picture: altitude was survival, firepower was victory, and durability meant the difference between a pilot coming home or disappearing over the channel. The problem was that these three requirements seemed mutually exclusive. High-altitude performance demanded powerful engines, which meant weight. Heavy armament meant more weight. Armor protection meant even more weight. Everything conventional wisdom said about fighter design screamed that this combination was impossible. But Kartveli had access to something revolutionary: the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial powerhouse capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. More importantly, when coupled with a turbo supercharger, this engine could maintain its power output at altitudes where other fighters struggled for breath. This was the key to solving the impossible equation. The XP-47B prototype that rolled out in May 1941 shocked everyone who saw it. At 12,086 pounds empty, it weighed nearly twice as much as the Supermarine Spitfire. The fuselage was enormous, necessitated by the complex ducting required for the turbo supercharger system. From certain angles, it genuinely did resemble a milk bottle, fat, round, and seemingly unsuited for the violent ballet of aerial combat. Republic's test pilot Larry Brabham took the prototype up for its first flight on May 6, 1941. The aircraft climbed like nothing he had ever experienced, the supercharger screaming as it compressed thin air and force-fed it into the hungry cylinders. At 25,000 feet, where most fighters struggled, the P-47 was just getting started. At 30,000 feet, it accelerated. At 35,000 feet, it dominated. But the prototype had problems, serious ones. The cockpit canopy fogged at altitude, visibility was poor, and the control responses felt sluggish compared to lighter fighters. The Army Air Forces were skeptical. They had ordered the aircraft based on paper specifications, but seeing this giant in the flesh raised doubts. Could American pilots really fight effectively in something this heavy? Chapter 2: Trial by Fire. The first P-47 Thunderbolts arrived in England in late 1942, assigned to the 56th Fighter Group based at Horsham St Giles. The pilots, most of whom had trained on nimble P-40s, stared at their new mounts with disbelief. Captain Hub Zemke, the group commander, later recalled, "When I first saw the P-47, I thought someone was playing a cruel joke. This wasn't a fighter, it was a tank with wings." The initial training flights only reinforced these concerns. The P-47 had a reputation for being unforgiving during takeoff and landing. Its massive engine created tremendous torque that could flip an inexperienced pilot during takeoff roll. The cockpit sat so far back that forward visibility on the ground was nearly non-existent. Pilots had to S-turn during taxi just to see where they were going. But Hub Zemke was no ordinary pilot, and he demanded his men master this beast. Through February and March 1943, the 56th Fighter Group trained relentlessly, learning the Thunderbolt's quirks and capabilities. They discovered that while the P-47 couldn't turn with a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt at low altitude, it could dive faster than anything in the sky. Its roll rate at high speeds was exceptional. And at altitude, above 25,000 feet, it was absolutely superior. April 15, 1943 marked the P-47's combat debut. The mission was a fighter sweep over France, escorting BR-17 bombers to the French coast. As the formation crossed into enemy airspace, German controllers vectored Jagdgeschwader 2 and JG-26 to intercept, two of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter wings, led by aces who had collectively shot down hundreds of Allied aircraft. The initial engagement was chaos. German pilots, seeing the bulky P-47s for the first time, attacked with the confidence born of experience. Hauptmann Johannes Seifert, flying a Focke-Wulf 190, maneuvered behind a Thunderbolt and opened fire, expecting the American to panic and attempt a turning dogfight, a fight the heavier P-47 could never win. But Lieutenant Robert Johnson, the P-47 pilot being attacked, had paid attention to Hub Zemke's training. Instead of turning, Johnson pushed the stick forward and dove. The Thunderbolt accelerated like a meteor, quickly leaving the surprised Focke-Wulf behind. The German pilot attempted to follow but had to pull out as his aircraft began vibrating dangerously at speeds the P-47 handled effortlessly. Johnson climbed back to altitude, his heart pounding, and rejoined the formation. He had survived his first encounter, but barely. The 56th Fighter Group returned to base without losses, but also without any confirmed victories. The pilots knew they had much to learn. Chapter 3: The Learning Curve. Through the spring and summer of 1943, both sides learned harsh lessons. For the Americans, the learning curve was steep and paid in blood. Early P-47 pilots tried to dogfight German fighters using traditional tactics, turning battles at medium altitude where the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 excelled. These encounters usually ended badly for the Thunderbolt pilots. Lieutenant Quince Brown wrote in his diary after an engagement in May 1943, tried to turn with a 109 today. Stupid mistake. Nearly got killed. The P-47 just mushes through turns at 15,000 feet. I could see the German pilot in my peripheral vision, hanging on my wing, probably laughing. Only survived because my wingman drove him off. But the Americans adapted quickly. Hub Zemke and other experienced commanders developed new tactics specifically designed around the P-47's strengths. They called it boom and zoom, attack from altitude, use superior speed in the dive to make a single devastating pass, then climb back to altitude using the Thunderbolt's exceptional zoom climb capability. Never, ever try to turn with the enemy at low altitude. The Germans, meanwhile, were learning something that contradicted their initial dismissal of the P-47. The aircraft could absorb punishment that would destroy any Luftwaffe fighter. Major Egon Meyer, commander of JG-2 and a skilled tactician, reported after an engagement in June 1943, "We are hitting these American aircraft repeatedly, seeing strikes all over the fuselage and wings, but they continue fighting. It's unnatural." What Meyer didn't know was that the P-47 incorporated armor protection that seemed excessive to European designers. The pilot sat in an armored bathtub, steel plates protecting from below, behind, and even on the sides. The oil cooler and critical systems had armor shields. Redundant control systems meant that even with significant battle damage, the aircraft remained flyable. The real revelation for German pilots came when they examined captured P-47s and shot down wrecks. The radial engine, which they had assumed would be The real revelation for German pilots came when they examined captured P-47s and shot down wrecks. The radial engine, which they had assumed would be vulnerable, was actually incredibly resilient. Unlike inline engines like those in the Messerschmitt, which could be disabled by a single hit to the cooling system, the R2800 radial had 18 separate cylinders spread around a circle. You could knock out several cylinders and the engine would keep running, albeit rough and smoking, but running enough to get the pilot home. Chapter 4: Robert Johnson's Day of Reckoning. June 26, 1943 became the date that defined the P-47's legendary durability and transformed perceptions on both sides of the conflict. Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson was flying bomber escort over France when his P-47, nicknamed All Hell, was attacked by Oberfeldwebel Egon Meyer's Focke-Wulf 190. What followed became the stuff of legend. Meyer positioned himself perfectly and opened fire at close range. His 20mm cannon shells and machine gun bullets tore into Johnson's aircraft. The canopy shattered. The instrument panel exploded. Shells ripped through the wing, fuselage, and tail. Johnson was hit in the shoulder by a shell fragment, his flight suit soaked with blood and hydraulic fluid. Meyer made pass after pass, pouring over 200 rounds into the P-47. He later reported being astonished that the American aircraft continued flying. Johnson, bleeding and semi-conscious, fought to maintain control as his aircraft shuddered under the repeated impacts. The stick felt dead in his hands. The rudder was barely responsive. Oil covered the windscreen. Through the haze of shock and pain, Johnson knew attempting to bail out would be suicide. The Germans would strafe him in his parachute or he would be captured. He had to get back across the channel. With his radio destroyed and half his instruments shot out, he pointed the battered P-47 west and nursed the damaged engine. Meyer, running low on ammunition, made one final pass. But as he closed to deliver the killing blow, he saw Johnson struggling at the controls, bleeding, clearly unable to defend himself. In a moment of chivalry that seemed from another era, Meyer pulled alongside, saluted, and peeled away. He could not bring himself to kill a defenseless fellow pilot who had shown such courage. Johnson coaxed the disintegrating P-47 across the channel. The engine was smoking badly, running on perhaps half its cylinders. The controls required both hands and all his strength. He was losing altitude steadily. As the English coast appeared through the oil-streaked windscreen, Johnson realized he was too low to bail out and too weak to make a controlled landing. He crash-landed at the first airfield he saw, the P-47 grinding across the grass in a shower of sparks and torn metal before finally stopping. Maintenance crews who examined the wreck counted over 200 bullet and cannon holes. The oil tank was destroyed. The oxygen system was riddled. The electrical system was barely functional. By all conventional logic, the aircraft should have disintegrated in mid-air. But it hadn't. Johnson survived, recovered from his wounds, and returned to combat, eventually flying 91 missions and scoring 27 aerial victories. His shot-up P-47 was photographed extensively and the images distributed to every fighter group. The caption read, "This is why you fly the P-47." The story spread rapidly across Allied bases. For the first time, pilots realized that the Thunderbolt could bring them home even when riddled with holes. Confidence surged. The Luftwaffe, on the other hand, began to fear the lumbering machine they once mocked. They called it Der Dickie, the Fat One. But now, that nickname carried a new tone: respect. Chapter 5: The Wall of Lead. The P-47's offensive potential came from its 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, capable of firing a combined 13 rounds per second. A single burst from all guns created a wall of metal that could tear through aircraft, locomotives, and light armor alike. German pilots who experienced that hail of fire firsthand reported seeing tracer streams that seemed less like bullets and more like a continuous laser of death. The .50 caliber slugs could rip through steel plates and fuel tanks with devastating results. Even near misses could shred control surfaces and ignite fuel vapors. The P-47's gun harmonization was usually set to converge at around 300 yards. In combat, that meant a disciplined pilot could unleash a 2-second burst and obliterate anything caught in his sights. Many Luftwaffe pilots never even saw the P-47s that shot them down. Thunderbolt pilots attacked from high-altitude dives, fired, and zoomed away before their opponents could react. Hub Zemke once described the P-47's guns as a portable anti-aircraft battery. In a sense, he wasn't exaggerating. The Thunderbolt could carry nearly the same weight in armament and ammunition as a small bomber. By mid-1943, American tactics had evolved to exploit this. Squadrons would attack in waves, first diving on German fighters climbing to intercept bombers, then on the bombers themselves, and finally strafing airfields on the return trip. The Luftwaffe's proud Jagdgeschwader found themselves under relentless pressure from an enemy that seemed immune to damage and capable of striking anywhere. The psychological effect was enormous. German pilots began reporting symptoms of what they called Thunderbolt sickness. They described feelings of helplessness as P-47 screamed down from the stratosphere, firing torrents of lead that shredded anything in their path. The Americans, once cautious and inexperienced, now flew with swagger. The Thunderbolt's climb and dive performance gave them control of every engagement. They dictated when and where to fight, and when to disengage. By autumn 1943, the Luftwaffe realized that its old tactics no longer worked. Head-on bomber attacks exposed them to the P-47's guns before they could reach the bombers. Flanking maneuvers were thwarted by high-altitude escorts. And diving away from combat, once a reliable escape, was now impossible, as the Thunderbolt could dive faster than any German fighter in service. The realization that this was the new standard of aerial combat was deeply unsettling. Chapter 6, Into the Storm, 1944. By early 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer just a fighter, it had become a symbol of American air power. Entire bomber formations now crossed the channel with P-47 escorts stretching for miles in every direction. Luftwaffe pilots began referring to them as the Silver Wall. Yet, as the air war intensified, new challenges emerged. The Thunderbolt's range, even with drop tanks, limited how far it could escort bombers into Germany. Once the P-47s turned back, German fighters, particularly the Focke-Wulf 190A and the new Bf 109G, would strike the unprotected bombers with deadly precision. Losses were mounting. Alexander Kartveli and his engineers at Republic Aviation knew they needed a solution. The answer was the P-47D model, equipped with underwing pylons for larger fuel tanks, bomb racks, and rockets. With these additions, the Thunderbolt transformed from a high-altitude interceptor into a multi-role juggernaut capable of long-range escort and ground attack. The P-47D-25 introduced the distinctive bubble canopy, eliminating the rear blind spot and giving pilots nearly 360-degree visibility, a crucial advantage in dogfights. Pilots who had once complained about the aircraft's size now praised its power, ruggedness, and versatility. One of them, Captain Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, would go on to become America's top European ace with 28 kills, all in the P-47. Gabreski once said, "If I had to choose between speed and survivability, I'd pick survivability every time. The Thunderbolt gave me both." The Luftwaffe, increasingly on the defensive, faced a nightmare. Every time they scrambled to intercept American bombers, they found themselves diving away from P-47s only to be chased and destroyed. German pilots who survived these encounters began requesting transfers to quieter fronts, claiming Thunderbolt fatigue. Chapter 7: The Ground Attack King. While the P-51 Mustang eventually took over the long-range escort role, the P-47 found a new calling: ground attack. With 8.50 caliber guns, bombs, and rockets, it became one of the most destructive close air support aircraft of the war. In Normandy, during and after D-Day, P-47 squadrons operated from hastily built airstrips in France, sometimes only a few miles behind the front lines. They destroyed tanks, trains, bridges, and columns of German vehicles with terrifying efficiency. A typical ground attack sortie involved 2 500-pound bombs, 10 5-inch rockets, and a full load of machine gun ammunition. The Thunderbolt could obliterate entire armored columns in minutes. German soldiers learned to dive for cover the moment they heard the unique howl of the R-2800 engine overhead. The Luftwaffe's General der Jagdflieger, Adolf Gauland, later wrote in his memoirs, "The P-47 was the scourge of the German army. Its pilots attacked with complete disregard for danger. Even flak could not stop them. It was a machine that could take more punishment than anything we had." Many pilots developed creative techniques to maximize their effect. Some would dive from 10,000 feet, release bombs at treetop level, and then pull up into a climb so steep it seemed impossible. Others strafed trains so precisely that they could hit individual carriages. The destruction was immense. German transportation networks collapsed under relentless Thunderbolt attacks. Trains stopped running in daylight. Vehicle convoys moved only at night. Bridges and supply depots were reduced to rubble. The P-47 became synonymous with Allied dominance in the skies and on the ground. One Luftwaffe survivor described it bitterly. "It was not enough that the P-47 ruled the air. It ruled the earth beneath it too." Chapter 8: The Men Who Mastered the Beast. The P-47's success was due not only to its design but also to the men who learned to tame it. Pilots like Hub Zemke, Gabreski, Robert Johnson, and Dave Schilling turned the Thunderbolt from a misunderstood machine into a legend. Zemke, now commanding the 56th Fighter Group, was known for his strict discipline and innovative tactics. He insisted that every pilot memorize enemy aircraft silhouettes, gun harmonization settings, and escape procedures. His group became the most successful P-47 unit in the European theater, credited with over 665 aerial victories. Gabreski's leadership was more personal. He flew with his men, took the same risks, and often led the first strike. He would walk the flight line before missions, shaking hands with each pilot and reminding them, "Remember, altitude is life insurance." Dave Schilling, another ace of the 56th, pioneered long-range escort techniques using drop tanks and fuel-saving climbs. His innovations allowed bombers to reach deeper into Germany with continuous fighter protection. For these men, the Thunderbolt was more than a machine, it was a companion. Many pilots named their aircraft, decorated them with nose art, and treated them with near-superstitious respect. One pilot's P-47 was named Big Ass Bird. Another called his Butch Baby. They believed their aircraft had personalities, some lucky, some temperamental, but all dependable. Chapter 9: Thunder over Europe. By late 1944, the skies over Europe were filled with the roar of thousands of P-47s and P-51s. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages, inexperienced pilots, and relentless Allied attacks left it reeling. The Thunderbolt was now everywhere, escorting bombers, strafing trains, blasting bunkers, and dive-bombing tanks. Its ability to deliver massive firepower and survive almost any hit made it indispensable. One German commander reportedly told his men, "If you see a single-engine American aircraft with 8 guns, don't fight it. Hide." Thunderbolt pilots flew multiple missions per day, returning with wings scorched by flak and fuselages peppered with bullet holes. Maintenance crews often joked that a P-47 could be rebuilt around the engine because it was usually the only intact part after combat. Despite the P-51 Mustang's fame, many veterans insisted that the P-47 was the true workhorse of the war. It could fight, bomb, and survive in ways few aircraft could match. Even the Germans grudgingly respected it. A captured Luftwaffe report described it as the most dangerous opponent at medium and high altitude, and the most destructive at low altitude. Chapter 10: The Endgame. As the Allies advanced into Germany in early 1945, the Thunderbolt's role shifted once more. It became the hammer that shattered the last remnants of German resistance. Columns of retreating troops, supplied trains, and armored divisions were cut to pieces by relentless air attacks. The 9th Air Force's P-47 groups averaged 1,500 sorties per day in March 1945 alone. They destroyed thousands of vehicles, hundreds of locomotives, and entire fuel depots. When fuel shortages grounded most of the Luftwaffe, the Thunderbolts operated with near impunity. For German soldiers on the ground, the sound of the P-47's dive was synonymous with death. Survivors often described the attacks as unavoidable. The aircraft appeared suddenly, fired, and disappeared before anti-aircraft gunners could react. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the P-47 had flown over 545,000 combat sorties and dropped more than 130,000 tons of bombs. Its pilots had claimed over 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air and countless more on the ground. When peace finally came, many pilots felt a strange emptiness. Their faithful machines, which had carried them through the worst of the war, were now to be scrapped or sold. Robert Johnson wrote in his memoir, "I walked away from my Thunderbolt for the last time. She had 268 bullet holes patched and a new coat of paint. She'd brought me home every time. I patted her cowling and whispered, 'Thank you.'" The .50 caliber machine gun was an inspired choice. Its ballistic performance was devastating against both aircraft and lightly armored vehicles. The gun's effective range and flat trajectory made it ideal for high-speed firing passes. Each P-47 carried 8 of them, 4 in each wing, with a total of 3,400 rounds. That was enough to sustain 30 to 35 seconds of continuous fire, though pilots rarely held the trigger that long. A half-second burst from all 8 guns could shred a fighter or rip through the wings of a bomber. By comparison, German fighters were armed with a combination of 20mm or 30mm cannons and 7.92mm machine guns. While the cannons were powerful, they fired at a slower rate and carried limited ammunition. A Bf-109 or FW-190 might only carry 150 to 200 cannon shells. Once those were gone, the pilot had to disengage or rely on less effective small-caliber guns. American doctrine emphasized hitting power and volume of fire over marksmanship. "Put the pipper on him and fire until he explodes," was the unofficial rule. This philosophy meshed perfectly with the P-47's stability and durability. A German ace could outturn or outclimb, but he couldn't ignore 8.50 cal spewing a wall of lead. German pilots who encountered the P-47's firepower described it as terrifying. Even a near miss could damage radiators, puncture oil lines, or riddle control surfaces. For a Luftwaffe pilot, being caught in that storm of tracers often meant instant death or a desperate dive for the deck. But beyond its guns, the P-47's biggest asset was altitude. Chapter 6: The Altitude Advantage. The Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharger, mounted in the rear fuselage, gave it a decisive edge at high altitude. While German fighters lost power above 20,000 feet, the P-47 maintained its climb and speed well beyond 30,000. That meant it could escort bombers on deep raids into Germany, something early Allied fighters like the P-38 and Spitfire struggled to do. German interceptors would climb desperately to meet the bombers at 25,000 to 28,000 feet, often straining their engines to the limit. By the time they reached the bomber stream, P-47s were already waiting above, ready to swoop down in deadly bounce attacks. The Thunderbolt's preferred tactic was the dive and zoom, use altitude to gain speed, attack with overwhelming force, then climb back out before the enemy could respond. This vertical combat style was well suited to the P-47's characteristics. It was too heavy for tight-turning dogfights, but in a dive, its weight and aerodynamics made it nearly unstoppable. In a controlled descent, a P-47 could exceed 500 miles per hour, faster than most German aircraft could follow. Pilots called it riding the thunder. A famous saying among Thunderbolt pilots was, "If you're in trouble, point the nose down." Many lived because of that. No German fighter could match the P-47's dive rate without structural failure. The FW-190's wings would begin to flutter at extreme speed, while the Bf-109's control surfaces locked up completely. This altitude advantage had strategic consequences. Luftwaffe units found themselves outmatched before combat even began. Their fuel consumption skyrocketed during high-altitude climbs, leaving little for extended engagements. P-47s, by contrast, could cruise efficiently at 30,000 feet, loiter over the target area, and still have power to spare for combat. As the U.S. 8th Air Force expanded its daylight bombing campaign, the Thunderbolt became the shield of the bomber fleets. Its presence forced German command to rethink their entire interception strategy. No longer could they simply climb, attack, and retreat. Every move was contested by fast, well-armed escorts that could follow them home. The psychological strain was immense: focus on attacking the bombers and risk being destroyed from above, or watch for fighters and miss opportunities to damage the bombers. Chapter 7: The Paddle Revolution. The early P-47 models were formidable but not perfect. Pilots often complained that at high altitudes or low speeds, the aircraft became sluggish. The huge propeller simply couldn't convert the engine's full power into thrust efficiently across all flight conditions. The solution came in the form of the paddle blade propeller, a broader, more aerodynamic design that transformed the Thunderbolt's handling. Introduced in mid-1943, this new propeller allowed the aircraft to climb faster, accelerate more sharply, and take off from shorter runways. A P-47D with a paddle blade could now outclimb the older Bf-109G at medium altitudes, something previously thought impossible. German pilots who had once relied on superior climb rates now found the tables turned. The improvement also enhanced dive recovery. Previously, pilots had to use both hands to pull out of steep dives, fighting the G-forces and the aircraft's resistance. With the new prop, recovery became smoother and safer, allowing more aggressive tactics. As one pilot said, it turned the Thunderbolt from a brute into a thoroughbred. The paddle blade modification was just one of many ongoing improvements. The U.S. Army Air Forces treated the P-47 as a living design, constantly refining it based on frontline feedback. New versions appeared in rapid succession: the D-15, D-20, D-25, each incorporating lessons learned in combat. The D-25 introduced a bubble canopy, vastly improving rearward visibility. Earlier models had a razorback spine that limited what pilots could see behind them, a dangerous flaw in air combat. With the new canopy, pilots could finally spot an enemy sneaking up from below or behind. The design was so effective that later American fighters, including the P-51D Mustang, adopted it too. Other upgrades followed: more internal fuel, better radios, improved oxygen systems, and stronger undercarriage. The Thunderbolt was evolving into a machine optimized not just for survival, but for domination. The long-range solution. As the Allied bombing campaign pushed deeper into Germany, range became a pressing issue. The P-47, for all its strengths, was thirsty. Its big radial engine consumed massive amounts of fuel, limiting escort missions to the western edge of Germany. Beyond that, bombers often flew unprotected, suffering terrible losses. Engineers solved this with the addition of drop tanks, streamlined auxiliary fuel containers mounted under the wings or belly. At first, these were simple metal tanks, but soon lightweight paper-based tanks were introduced, saving aluminum for other uses. The paper tanks were impregnated with resin to make them fuel-tight and were discarded once empty. With these tanks, the P-47's range nearly doubled. It could now accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back, staying in formation for the duration of the mission. This transformed strategic bombing into a far more sustainable campaign. For German defenders, there was now no respite. Wherever the bombers went, the Thunderbolts were there too. The tactical shift. By late 1943 and early 1944, the Luftwaffe situation had deteriorated. Every month brought new raids, new losses, and fewer experienced pilots to replace the fallen. In response, American commanders began shifting P-47 units toward more aggressive roles. No longer content to simply escort, Thunderbolt pilots began hunting the hunters. Fighter sweeps, deep penetration raids without bombers, became common. Squadrons would fly ahead of bomber formations to clear the skies of interceptors or ambush them as they climbed to meet the bombers. The results were devastating. Entire Luftwaffe wings were wiped out before even reaching combat altitude. The P-47's combination of speed, firepower, and survivability made it ideal for this hunter role. Pilots roamed German airspace with increasing confidence, strafing airfields, trains, and convoys on their way home. Every sortie chipped away at the Reich's dwindling resources. The invasion prelude. In preparation for the D-Day invasion, Thunderbolt squadrons were redeployed across southern England. Their new mission was not just to protect the bombers but to clear the skies over the upcoming invasion beaches and disrupt enemy logistics. For weeks before June 6, 1944, P-47s attacked rail yards, fuel depots, and communication lines across France. When D-Day came, the Thunderbolt was everywhere. Flying low over Normandy, it strafed German convoys, destroyed bridges, and blasted tanks trying to reach the front. Its ruggedness allowed it to operate from hastily built airstrips in the French countryside, some barely longer than a football field. The aircraft's ability to absorb damage was legendary by then. Pilots often returned with large holes in their wings or missing chunks of control surfaces. Mechanics joked that a Thunderbolt could lose half its tail and still bring you home. Field modifications and frontline adaptation. As the campaign moved inland, ground crews became masters of improvisation. They fitted P-47s with bombs, rockets, and napalm tanks, turning them into formidable ground attack machines. A single P-47 could deliver a heavier ordnance load than a World War I bomber, yet still fight its way home. Some pilots painted names and artwork on their planes, fierce tigers, pin-up girls, or skull motifs. The aircraft became personal symbols of defiance and identity. One Thunderbolt bore the inscription "No Guts, No Glory" in bold white letters on its fuselage, a phrase that would become the unofficial motto of the 56th Fighter Group. Chapter 8: The Tactical Edge. With the paddle propeller, the bubble canopy, and increased range, the P-47 had evolved into one of the most complete fighters of the war. But perhaps its greatest advantage lay not in technology, but in doctrine. American training emphasized teamwork, communication, and initiative. Pilots flew in flexible four-plane formations, allowing them to adapt quickly to changing situations. German units, by contrast, were increasingly composed of green replacements, hastily trained and poorly coordinated. Experienced aces were forced to lead entire squadrons single-handedly. The result was predictable: confusion, fear, and collapse under pressure. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe commanders openly admitted they could no longer contest air superiority. The skies belonged to the Allies. Chapter 9: The Thunderbolt over Normandy. June 1944. The invasion of Europe had begun. As Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the sky above them roared with the sound of hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts. The aircraft played a decisive role in Operation Overlord, not only as escorts but as flying artillery. In the first days of the invasion, Thunderbolts operated almost continuously from dawn to dusk. They flew hundreds of sorties per day, dropping bombs and firing rockets at German positions. Roads leading to the beaches became death traps, clogged with burning vehicles destroyed by relentless air attacks. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin of the 56th Fighter Group later recalled, "We were flying so low we could see the faces of German soldiers. Tanks tried to hide under trees, but our .50 caliber rounds cut right through the branches." The P-47 wasn't just a fighter anymore, it was a hammer striking the German war machine. Air superiority achieved. By July, the Allies had complete control of the skies over Normandy. German aircraft appeared rarely, and when they did, they were quickly swarmed and destroyed. The Luftwaffe's once proud fighter force was now a shadow of its former self. This air dominance allowed the Allied ground forces to move freely during daylight. Supply convoys, reinforcements, and field hospitals operated without fear of enemy attack. German commanders complained bitterly that even a single movement of tanks or artillery during the day was suicidal. A German officer wrote in his diary, "Whenever we hear the growl of those American engines, we dive for cover. The Thunderbolts own the sky, and the earth beneath it." Close air support evolution. Normandy marked a new chapter in air warfare, the birth of modern close air support. Thunderbolt pilots coordinated with ground troops using radio contact, striking enemy positions within minutes of being called. This responsiveness was revolutionary and often turned the tide of battle. At St. Lo, for example, Allied forces were pinned down by stubborn German resistance. Within hours, waves of P-47s attacked the defensive lines with bombs and rockets, shattering the enemy's fortifications. When the dust cleared, the ground troops advanced almost unopposed. Pilots often flew so low that they risked being hit by their own bomb fragments or ground fire. Yet morale remained sky-high. They knew that every sortie directly saved lives on the ground. The legend of Jug. Among American pilots, the P-47 earned an affectionate nickname, Jug. Some said it stood for Juggernaut, others for Jug of Milk, recalling its rounded shape. Whatever the origin, it captured the aircraft's personality perfectly: massive, tough, and unstoppable. The Jug became a symbol of reliability. Pilots trusted it with their lives, and mechanics loved working on it. Its radial engine, unlike liquid-cooled engines, could take multiple hits and keep running. Even with oil streaming out and cylinders blown apart, the RO-2800 somehow brought its pilots home. Stories of survival were legendary. One pilot landed safely after losing half a wingtip, another made it back with the tail nearly shot off. Ground crews began counting bullet holes for fun, sometimes over 200 in a single aircraft. Chapter 10: The Strategic Shift. As Allied armies pushed eastward, the role of the Thunderbolt continued to expand. With air superiority secured, commanders realized the P-47's true potential as a tactical weapon of destruction. Every bridge, train, and fuel convoy became a target. From forward air bases in France, P-47 squadrons fanned out daily, flying missions into Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Luftwaffe rarely showed up. Instead, flak, anti-aircraft fire, became the main threat. Pilots learned to weave, dive, and roll at treetop height, using speed as their best defense. By autumn 1944, entire sections of the German railway network were paralyzed. Coal shortages crippled factories. Fuel depots burned for days. The Thunderbolt had become not just a fighter, but a precision weapon of economic warfare. Into Germany. When Allied forces crossed into German territory in early 1945, Thunderbolts led the way. They flew armed reconnaissance, attacking anything that moved ahead of advancing troops. Bridges, tanks, armored cars, and even horse-drawn wagons fell victim to their guns and rockets. One mission report from the 9th Air Force read simply: Target: road traffic. Result: destroyed. Civilians called them death from the clouds. German morale plummeted as Thunderbolts patrolled above every major road and river crossing. Nothing could move without being spotted and attacked. Facing the jet age. But even as victory approached, a new threat appeared: the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was faster than anything in the sky, capable of outrunning any propeller-driven aircraft. For a brief moment, the balance seemed to shift again. Yet even this miracle weapon could not change the outcome. P-47 pilots learned to ambush the jets during takeoff or landing when they were slow and vulnerable. On several occasions, Thunderbolts shot down Me-262s using superior tactics and patience. Colonel Hubert Zemke himself claimed one such kill, describing it as like catching a hawk in a cage. The age of jet warfare had begun, but the Thunderbolt refused to be outclassed. Chapter 11: The End of the War. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over. The Luftwaffe was annihilated, and the once invincible German war machine lay in ruins. The P-47 had played a central role in that destruction. It flew more combat sorties than any other U.S. fighter in the European theater, over 746,000 missions. It destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft in the air and tens of thousands on the ground. Its pilots dropped 132,000 tons of bombs and fired 135 million rounds of ammunition. No other fighter combined range, power, and survivability so effectively. When the guns finally fell silent, many Thunderbolt pilots gathered for a final formation flight, a tribute to the machine that had carried them through the storm. As they passed overhead, mechanics and ground crews looked up, saluting the sound that had become the anthem of victory. Chapter 12: After the Thunder. The war's end brought both triumph and uncertainty. With peace restored, the mighty P-47 Thunderbolt suddenly found itself without a clear purpose. Jet aircraft were the future, and propeller-driven fighters, even ones as successful as the Thunderbolt, were becoming obsolete overnight. Many units transitioned quickly to newer designs like the P-80 Shooting Star. Yet the P-47's reputation and rugged reliability ensured it wouldn't disappear quietly. Instead, it found a second life in roles and countries far beyond its original battlefield. Post-war service. In the years immediately following World War II, thousands of surplus Thunderbolts were sent overseas. They served in the newly formed air forces of nations rebuilding from the ashes of conflict: France, Italy, Mexico, Brazil, and even China. In South America, the P-47 became a mainstay, patrolling vast borders and serving as a deterrent throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. Some nations used the aircraft for nearly 2 decades after the war. The Dominican Air Force, for instance, operated Thunderbolts well into the 1960s, making them some of the last combat-ready jugs in history. Korea and beyond. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the U.S. Air Force initially relied on jet fighters, but the early jets had short range and limited payloads. Once again, the qualities of the P-47, range, toughness, and heavy ordnance capacity, seemed ideal for ground attack missions. However, by then, the P-51 Mustang and newer aircraft had taken over the role. Still, a few Thunderbolts saw limited use in training and reserve units during that period. In a sense, the spirit of the P-47 lived on in later aircraft, the Republic F-84 Thunderjet and F-105 Thunderchief, both designed by the same company. Each carried forward the Thunderbolt's DNA, speed, firepower, and survivability. Engineering legacy. Aviation engineers often refer to the P-47 as the bridge between eras. It represented the pinnacle of piston engine fighter design, the moment before jet propulsion forever changed aviation. The Thunderbolt systems were complex but brilliantly integrated. Its turbo-supercharger setup, for example, became a model of engineering efficiency, demonstrating how raw power could be tamed for high-altitude performance. It also set new standards for pilot safety. The armored cockpit, redundant systems, and self-sealing fuel tanks became standard features in post-war aircraft. Many of the lessons learned from the P-47's design influenced not just fighters but also the development of early jet bombers and transports. Cultural impact. For the men who flew it, the Thunderbolt was more than a machine, it was a companion. Decades later, veterans still spoke of it with affection, describing it as the airplane that never let you down. Reunions of Thunderbolt groups became emotional gatherings where old comrades reminisced about the roar of the R-2800 and the feel of the control stick in their hands. Hollywood and literature later celebrated the P-47's legacy. In films, documentaries, and war memoirs, it often symbolized the resilience and ingenuity of the American fighting spirit. While the sleeker P-51 Mustang stole the spotlight in popular culture, many historians argue that the war in Europe could not have been won without the brute strength and reliability of the Thunderbolt. Preservation and restoration. Today, fewer than 100 P-47s survive, and only a few dozen remain airworthy. Museums and private collectors around the world work tirelessly to preserve them. Restoring a Thunderbolt is no small feat. The aircraft's massive radial engine and complex turbo system require thousands of hours of meticulous labor. One of the most famous restorations is the Wicked Wobbit, a fully functional P-47D that flies at airshows across the United States. Its deep, rumbling engine draws crowds wherever it goes. When it lifts off, trailing smoke and sunlight off its polished aluminum skin, spectators are transported back to the skies of 1944. The thunder rolls on. In 2020, a newly restored Thunderbolt took flight in Duxford, England, nearly 80 years after the original prototype. The pilot, test engineer Steve Hinton, described the experience. "It's like riding a living piece of history. You feel the vibrations, the weight, the strength. It's not just flying, it's time travel." At every airshow, the P-47's unmistakable sound, the deep growl of the R-2800, reminds onlookers of an era when power and courage ruled the skies. Reflections from the pilots. In their old age, surviving P-47 pilots often described their aircraft with a single word: trust. It might not have been the fastest, but it was the one that brought them home. When asked what made it special, Captain Robert Johnson once said, "You could shoot it, set it on fire, blow pieces off it, and it would still find a way to get you back. That's not an airplane. That's a friend." Another veteran, Quince Brown, summed it up more simply. "The jug forgave your mistakes. That's what kept you alive." Chapter 13, The Myth and the Machine. Over time, the P-47 became more than a warplane, it became a symbol. Its bulky shape, once mocked by German pilots, came to represent something deeper, the industrial might and determination of a free people united by purpose. The Thunderbolt was a paradox, heavy but fast, clumsy-looking but deadly, massive but agile when it mattered. It reflected the American philosophy of warfare: build big, build strong, and never underestimate reliability. While sleeker designs captured imaginations, the P-47 was the true workhorse, a machine that fought day after day without glamour, but with absolute effectiveness. Historians now place the Thunderbolt among the most successful fighter aircraft ever built. Not because it was beautiful, but because it did everything asked of it, and more. Aftermath of the Thunderbolt. After the war, thousands of Thunderbolts were retired, their roles taken over by jets like the F-84 and F-86. But their legend continued to grow. Pilots from the Pacific Theater told similar tales of P-47s flying long overwater missions, striking Japanese shipping, and enduring enemy fire that would have torn lesser planes apart. In Burma, the T-Bolts became jungle warriors, blasting Japanese supply lines along the Irrawaddy River. In the Philippines, they provided close air support during the Liberation Campaign. Even when the Pacific War demanded range beyond the P-47's limit, the aircraft adapted, fitted with drop tanks and new navigation systems to extend its reach. By 1949, only a handful remained in U.S. service, but many continued to serve in foreign air forces, including those of Brazil, Mexico, and France. For years, the Thunderbolt flew in conflicts far from its original war, a veteran of battles that shaped modern air warfare. Influence on aviation. The Thunderbolt changed how engineers thought about aircraft survivability. Its design proved that armor and speed could coexist, that an aircraft didn't have to be fragile to be effective. Its radial engine, though bulky, saved countless lives. Unlike liquid-cooled engines, it could take hits and keep running. Many post-war aircraft incorporated similar redundant systems to increase pilot safety. Republic Aviation's engineers later applied lessons from the P-47 to new designs, most notably the F-84 Thunderjet and F-105 Thunderchief, both direct descendants in philosophy and name. These aircraft emphasized firepower, range, and toughness, echoes of the Thunderbolt's legacy in jet form. In popular culture. While Hollywood often focused on the Mustang, documentaries and restoration projects have revived the Thunderbolt's reputation. Films and games now portray it as the unsung hero of the European skies, the flying tank that soldiers on the ground always wanted above them. In museums across the world, from Duxford in England to the Smithsonian in Washington, restored P-47s stand gleaming, wings broad and powerful. Visitors often express surprise at its size; it's almost twice as heavy as most World War II fighters. Standing beneath it, you understand why it was called the Jug. The human side. For the men who flew it, the P-47 was more than metal and bolts, it was a companion. Pilots often painted names, cartoons, or loved ones' portraits on its nose: Little Chief, Lucky Lady, Miss Fire, Sleepy Time Gal. These artworks turned machines into personalities, each with a story. Letters from pilots reveal deep emotional bonds. "She always brought me home," one wrote. "I'd land, see holes in the wings, oil on the canopy, and realize she took it all for me." These human touches transform the Thunderbolt from a mere war machine into a symbol of trust between man and metal. Legacy and lessons. Modern military strategists often cite the P-47 when discussing air-ground coordination and the psychology of dominance. Its combination of precision strikes and psychological intimidation broke not only enemy lines but morale. The sound of a P-47 diving at full throttle became, for many German troops, a signal to abandon their positions. In an age of drones and precision-guided munitions, the lessons of the Thunderbolt remain: durability, adaptability, and human courage still matter more than technology alone. Surviving Thunderbolts. As of today, around 15 airworthy P-47s remain worldwide. Each one represents thousands of man-hours of restoration, recovering rare parts, rebuilding engines, and repainting original squadron markings. Enthusiasts spend millions to preserve them, not for glory but for remembrance. At airshows, crowds still gather when the announcer says, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt." Then the sky fills with that deep roar, and history lives again. Closing reflection. The P-47 Thunderbolt story is not one of glamour but of grit. It lacked the sleek elegance of the Spitfire or the fame of the Mustang, yet it was the backbone of Allied air power. It carried the fight to the enemy day after day, storm after storm. In every dented panel and faded insignia lies the story of a world that refused to surrender, a world rebuilt through courage, engineering, and sheer will. The Jug remembered. At reunions of the 56th Fighter Group, now few and far between, old pilots still call it by its nickname, the Jug. They laugh, they argue about who had the best dive angle, and they grow silent when someone mentions a name carved into a memorial stone. One veteran summed it up best. The Thunderbolt wasn't beautiful, but she was ours. And she never failed us. Final words. Today, when a P-47 takes flight, it reminds us that progress is built on persistence. It is the echo of a time when courage was measured not by words, but by wings. May the sound of the Thunderbolt always remind us, freedom was earned, not given.